I always knew they were watching, but I never imagined they'd go this far. Not diplomacy, not pressure, not sanctions. This time, Israel sent shadows into my soil. Unmarked faces, satellite intercepts, encrypted drones, bribes funneled through third parties. They called it intelligence gathering. I call it a declaration of war. When my Minister of Internal Security slid the file across my desk, I didn't flinch. I opened it as if I were reading a death certificate, because in some ways I was. It was the death of trust, the death of diplomacy, the death of whatever remained of normal relations between Burkina Faso and the Israeli state. Inside the manila envelope were photographs, wiretaps, transaction receipts, an entire covert operation orchestrated under Netanyahu's command, right here in my capital. The final page read in bold black ink, Operation Dustpan, Objective Neutralize Pan, African Realignment. That was me. I was the realignment. And Netanyahu had just crossed the red line. He didn't just spy on a leader, he tried to infiltrate a revolution. Now the world would hear my answer. The intelligence file was thicker than any document I had ever received as president. 347 pages of meticulously documented evidence exposing Israeli surveillance operations on Burkina Faso soil. Each page told a story of sovereignty violated, trampled underfoot by operatives who believed African nations existed for their convenience and exploitation. The photographs were the most disturbing. High-resolution images taken from impossible angles, clearly captured by surveillance equipment far more sophisticated than anything our security services possessed. Pictures of private meetings in government buildings. Shots taken through the windows of my personal residence. Facial recognition scans of my family members going about their daily lives. The message was unmistakable: we can see everything, we can reach everyone, nowhere is safe from our oversight. But the wiretaps revealed the true extent of their ambitions. Hours of recorded conversations between my ministers captured through compromised communication systems we had believed were secure. Discussions about policy decisions, strategic planning sessions, even personal conversations about family matters and health concerns. They had violated not just our governmental processes, but our basic human dignity. The transaction receipts told perhaps the most damaging story of all, a complex web of financial transfers showing how Israeli intelligence had systematically corrupted elements within our society. Payments to local officials for access to restricted areas. Bribes to telecommunications workers for installing surveillance equipment. Compensation to former military officers for providing intelligence about our security protocols. They had created a shadow network of assets and informants operating in parallel to our legitimate government structures. Most chilling was how long this operation had been running. The oldest documents dated back 18 months, just weeks after our announcement of the Saudi-Pakistan alliance. They had been watching us, infiltrating us, mapping our weaknesses and vulnerabilities from the very beginning of our independence-minded policies. Every decision we made, every strategy we developed, every relationship we built, all of it had been monitored, analyzed, and reported back to Tel Aviv in real time. The operational scope was breathtaking in audacity and terrifying in implication. They hadn't just placed a few spies in our capital. They had built an entire intelligence architecture designed to monitor and manipulate our government's functioning. Communication intercepts, financial surveillance, behavioral analysis, predictive modeling of our policy decisions. They knew what we were going to do before we knew it ourselves. What made the operation truly insidious was its integration with seemingly legitimate activities. Israeli technology companies had provided our government with cybersecurity software that contained hidden backdoors. Agricultural advisors had installed monitoring equipment in rural areas under the guise of crop optimization programs. Medical assistance programs had been used as cover for biometric data collection and population surveillance. It started with whispers, unusual foreign advisors showing up at hotels with no agenda, technology contracts that vanished after signing, unmarked diplomatic crates arriving in the dead of night. We were rebuilding, laying roads, repaving trade routes, printing school books that told our truth rather than colonial lies. And suddenly, everything seemed to stall. The pattern was so subtle it took months for our security services to recognize it as systematic sabotage rather than random technical failures. Each incident seemed isolated, easily explained by bureaucratic missteps or infrastructure shortcomings. A power grid failure here, a communication outage there, a transportation delay somewhere else. But when examined together, they revealed a coordinated campaign to undermine our development projects and manufacture an atmosphere of dysfunction and unreliability. The Israeli operatives had studied our systems with almost academic precision, pinpointing exactly which components to target for maximum disruption with minimal risk of detection. They knew a dramatic attack would rally our people against foreign interference, but slow erosion of essential services would breed frustration and political instability. Fertile ground for manipulation through local proxies. Satellites began rerouting. A critical power substation failed without explanation. A fiber optic link between ministries went dark for 3 days. We suspected sabotage. In reality, it was surveillance. Israeli cyber units had infiltrated our networks through compromised aid organizations, deploying malware into our government's internal servers and masking the data trail with servers based in Ghana and Cyprus. This was not curiosity, it was war-level espionage. Their cyber operations were extraordinarily sophisticated, leveraging attack vectors that indicated access to cutting-edge tools typically reserved for major military conflicts. The malware was modular, adaptable to various systems, able to persist even through security updates and hardware replacements. Most alarming was its real-time data exfiltration capability. They weren't simply stealing information, they were creating a live feed of our government's inner workings. Routing through third countries exposed the global scale of their intelligence network. Ghana and Cyprus were not mere relay points. They were critical nodes in a surveillance system designed to monitor African governments while maintaining plausible deniability. If caught, Israel could claim the attacks originated elsewhere, complicating retaliation and shielding itself diplomatically. The use of aid organizations as attack vectors was especially cynical. Humanitarian groups are supposed to be protected, their work too vital to compromise. By weaponizing humanitarian aid, Israeli intelligence broke fundamental principles governing civilized relations between nations. When I followed the money, all paths led to Netanyahu's desk. The financial structure was deliberately complex: shell companies, cryptocurrency transactions, offshore accounts, but the ultimate authorization came from the highest levels of the Israeli government. This was no rogue operation or low-level initiative. It was a deliberate policy decision. The funding trail revealed the scale of their investment. Over 40 million spent across 18 months. This wasn't routine intelligence gathering. It was a sustained, professional campaign to destabilize our government. The resources dedicated showed they considered our independence. Minded policies a serious threat requiring constant pressure. Even more disturbing was the discovery of similar funding streams directed at other African nations. Mali, Niger, Chad, and several Sahel states, all showing signs of resisting Western hegemony. We were not a lone target, we were part of a continent-wide effort to crush African unity and independence. I stayed silent at first. I collected proof. Every intercepted email, every drone frequency we jammed, every fake NGO they used as cover, and then I made a choice. If Netanyahu wanted a shadow war, I would drag it into the light. The decision to expose the operation demanded a careful weighing of risks and benefits. Going public would almost certainly provoke retaliation, possibly in the form of even more aggressive destabilization efforts. But staying silent would allow the operation to continue unchecked and signal to other potential targets that such violations could occur without consequence. Our evidence gathering took weeks of painstaking work by our best intelligence professionals, aided by technical experts from allied nations who verified the authenticity of the digital evidence and mapped the operational networks. We needed documentation that would stand up to international scrutiny, not just persuade those already sympathetic to our cause. The psychological strain during this period was immense. Knowing every conversation might be monitored, every decision analyzed, Every movement tracked created an atmosphere of paranoia that threatened to paralyze the functioning of government itself. Ministers began second-guessing routine communications. Staff became suspicious of new colleagues. The basic trust necessary for effective governance began to erode. Yet we also used that knowledge strategically, feeding false information through channels we knew were compromised, tracking how it spread, and gradually charting the full extent of their operational network. We turned their surveillance apparatus into our own source of intelligence about their capabilities and intentions. When the time came, I called the press, not just local outlets. I summoned Al Jazeera, TRT, CCTV Africa, Press TV, and even reluctant networks from France and Germany. I handed them the evidence myself, live and unfiltered. And I said one sentence: Burkina Faso has been violated by an ally in peacetime, by a regime that fears African independence more than it fears war. The press conference was unlike anything in modern African diplomacy. Instead of vague accusations or second-hand claims, we presented primary documentation that proved our case beyond doubt. Journalists who arrived skeptical of such serious allegations against a Western ally were confronted with evidence too comprehensive to dismiss. The reaction was immediate and electric. Within hours, the story trended globally under the hashtag #ForBurkina Betrayed, spreading across languages and continents. African social media erupted in solidarity and outrage while international audiences struggled to grasp the implications of systematic surveillance of a sovereign nation. But the most consequential reaction came from other African governments. They began reaching out quietly to share their own suspicions about unexplained technical problems and security breaches once attributed to local causes. The revelation that Israel had been conducting systematic surveillance across Africa ignited a continent-wide conversation about technological sovereignty and foreign interference. The story went viral in hours. Yet that wasn't the real message. The real message came 24 hours later when I stood before the National Assembly and declared, "We will not be your experiment. We will not be your proxy. We will not be your colony." I announced the permanent expulsion of all Israeli diplomatic staff, giving their security liaison 72 hours to leave. I canceled $210 million in defense contracts with Israeli tech firms and froze all intelligence sharing agreements. Burkina Faso was cutting the cord. The National Assembly session was broadcast live across Africa, watched by millions who had never seen an African leader so openly and comprehensively reject foreign interference. The symbolism was powerful. An African parliament, filled with representatives elected by African people, making sovereign decisions about African interests without seeking permission from former colonial powers or their allies. The expulsion of diplomatic staff was particularly significant because it showed we were willing to accept the consequences of our actions. Severing diplomatic relations represents a break that cannot easily be repaired. We chose dignity over convenience, sovereignty over security cooperation. The cancellation of defense contracts sent shockwaves through Israel's military-industrial complex, signaling to other African governments the economic leverage they held. Israel's defense industry depended heavily on African customers, both for revenue and as testing grounds for new technologies. Our rejection of their contracts would cost Israeli companies hundreds of millions in lost revenue and tarnish their reputation across the continent. Most importantly, the freezing of intelligence sharing agreements revealed our understanding of the true nature of such partnerships. Intelligence cooperation is never truly reciprocal. It always flows primarily toward the more powerful partner, giving them insight into the weaker partner's decision-making processes, vulnerabilities, and strategic thinking. By ending these arrangements, we chose ignorance over infiltration. Netanyahu did not blink. Instead, he doubled down. 2 days later, anonymous sources leaked to Western media that Burkina Faso was harboring extremist elements, a classic smear campaign. Then came cyber attacks, ministry websites taken offline, fake statements released in my name, and even my personal phone bombarded with spyware attempts traced back to a Pegasus variant made in Israel. The retaliation campaign exposed the full extent of Israeli intelligence capabilities and their willingness to deploy them against African nations that refused to submit to their oversight. The cyber attacks were highly sophisticated, striking not only government systems, but also civilian infrastructure critical to our economy and society. The fake statements released in my name were crafted to sow confusion and erode my credibility at home and abroad. Fabricated policy announcements, false diplomatic communications, and manufactured controversies designed to spark political crises and distract from the surveillance revelations. The Pegasus spyware attacks were especially invasive, targeting not just my official communications, but also my private devices used for family matters. The psychological effect was as deliberate as the intelligence collection itself. They wanted me to feel there was no safe space, no privacy they couldn't violate at will. But while they were watching us, we were watching them. Our intelligence operatives caught an Israeli contractor posing as a telecom advisor. We intercepted footage from meetings in Kivyar, where Netanyahu's envoys attempted to bribe ex-generals to destabilize the Sahel region. Then came the final insult. An unmarked Israeli surveillance balloon entered our airspace, high altitude, transmitting in real time. We shot it down, recovered the drives, and confirmed everything. Netanyahu wasn't merely gathering intelligence, he was planning preemptive disruption. The balloon's incursion marked a new threshold, crossing from covert operations into potential acts of war. Violating national airspace with military surveillance equipment is a fundamental breach of sovereignty that justifies defensive action under international law. Our decision to bring it down sent a clear message. We would defend our territorial integrity against any intrusion. The recovered equipment provided the final proof of systematic Israeli operations. The drives contained detailed maps of our military installations, communication networks, and critical infrastructure, as well as operational plans for sabotage, targeting assessments for power plants, water treatment facilities, and transportation hubs. Most disturbing were the psychological profiles compiled on key government officials, military commanders, and civil society leaders. These files catalog personal vulnerabilities, family ties, financial situations, and behavioral patterns that could be exploited for blackmail or manipulation. It was a comprehensive target list for coercion. Within 48 hours, African leaders began reaching out. Mali, Chad, Guinea, Congo, Sudan, Ethiopia. Some were shocked, others simply nodded, already suspecting. One president told me quietly, "Someone finally said it." The African Union called an emergency closed-door session. I stood before 44 delegates, held up the declassified files, and said, "If they can do this to me, they can do it to any of you. This isn't about Burkina Faso. This is about sovereignty and black skin." That session marked a turning point in continental politics. The first time foreign surveillance was treated as a collective threat demanding a coordinated response. The evidence we presented sparked immediate requests for technical support from member states eager to assess their own vulnerabilities. The phrase, "sovereignty and black skin," resonated across Africa because it captured the racial dimension of these operations, an unspoken assumption that African governments could be surveilled, manipulated, and controlled with impunity, reflecting deep-seated racist attitudes that lingered long after formal decolonization. That night, 6 African nations froze their defense procurement talks with Israel. The Arab League issued a rare statement affirming Burkina Faso's right to defend its sovereignty against technological warfare. Netanyahu's government, meanwhile, denied everything. They called it a hoax, claiming the evidence was manipulated by hostile actors. But we had timestamps, metadata, radio frequencies, and blockchain trails. Truth doesn't need to scream, it only needs to be shown. The coordinated response from multiple African governments proved our revelations had sparked a larger movement toward technological sovereignty and resistance to foreign interference. Freezing defense contracts cost Israeli companies billions in lost revenue and sent a clear signal about the economic price of violating African sovereignty. The Arab League statement was especially significant, symbolizing solidarity between Arab and African nations against Israeli interference. and potentially reshaping Middle Eastern and African relations in ways that challenge traditional Western-dominated frameworks. So now, Mr. Netanyahu, let me speak directly to you. You underestimated something profound. You thought you were dealing with a man, but you were dealing with a movement. You thought you were surveilling a government, but you were surveilling a generation. I am not your puppet. Burkina Faso is not your satellite. Africa is not your backdoor battlefield. We are not anti-Semitic. We are not warmongers. We are not looking for enemies, but we will not bow. If you believe Africa can be bullied into submission with spyware, contracts, and fake diplomacy, you are decades behind the times. We are no longer asking for respect, we are demanding it. And if your response is escalation, know this: we've built a new Africa where dignity is our firewall. And no spyware can breach the soul of a people who have chosen freedom over fear. To every nation watching, this is no longer a dispute between Burkina Faso and Israel. This is a test of how far Africa has come. We will not be silent. We will not be silenced. This continent has fed the world, built its cities, and mined its riches. Now we reclaim something even more valuable: our voice. And if that terrifies those who once ruled us, perhaps they were never ready for a free Africa in the first place. Let them spy. Let them scheme. We have seen their playbook, and now we write our own. Country or death, dignity or nothing, Africa will rise. The aftermath of our revelations created ripple effects neither we nor our adversaries had fully anticipated. Within 72 hours of the press conference, our secure communication channels were overwhelmed with messages from across the global south. Presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and intelligence chiefs from nations spanning 3 continents reached out with variations of the same urgent question: how do we know if they're doing this to us too? The hunger for technological sovereignty our actions exposed was staggering. Countries that had never questioned their relationships with Israeli technology firms began auditing their defense systems. Nations that had welcomed Israeli agricultural advisors started demanding comprehensive background checks on foreign technical personnel. Governments that had proudly showcased partnerships with Israeli cybersecurity firms quietly began seeking alternatives. But the most significant response came from an unexpected quarter: the technical professionals who had been unknowingly complicit in the surveillance operations. Within days of our evidence release, anonymous messages poured in from engineers, programmers, and technicians who had worked on Israeli projects across Africa. They provided documentation, technical specifications, and insider knowledge that filled critical gaps in our understanding of the operations. A software engineer from Mali sent detailed schematics of backdoors built into voter registration systems. A telecommunications specialist from Senegal provided evidence of monitoring equipment installed in cellular tower infrastructure. A cybersecurity consultant from Kenya revealed how security assessments had been covert intelligence gathering operations designed to map government vulnerabilities. These technical whistleblowers represented a new kind of resistance movement: professionals with intimate knowledge of modern surveillance systems, driven by conscience to expose the abuse of their expertise. Their contributions transformed our evidence collection from a reactive investigation into a proactive intelligence operation capable of anticipating and countering future threats. The psychological impact on Israeli intelligence operations was immediate and severe. Operational security protocols that had relied on African ignorance of technical capabilities suddenly became liabilities. Personnel operating under light cover found themselves exposed and vulnerable. Communication networks, once assumed secure, were revealed to be monitored and analyzed by their targets. Most damaging of all was the revelation of how systematic and coordinated these operations had been. The evidence painted a picture not of isolated intelligence efforts, but of a comprehensive strategy to maintain technological dependence and prevent African technological sovereignty. Every partnership had been designed to create vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Every assistance program had embedded components serving Israeli intelligence interests. The economic implications extended far beyond the immediate cancellations of contracts. Israeli technology companies had built their African business models on the assumption that African governments lacked both the technical sophistication to detect surveillance and the political will to reject it. Our actions shattered those assumptions, creating a crisis of confidence that threatened their entire continental strategy. Stock prices for major Israeli defense contractors plummeted as investors realized their African revenue streams were no longer secure. International customers began demanding transparency and oversight for Israeli technology purchases. Military cooperation agreements that were once routine approvals became subjects of parliamentary debate and public scrutiny. Diplomatic consequences were equally severe. Israel's carefully cultivated image as a reliable partner for developing nations was replaced by suspicions about hidden surveillance capabilities and ulterior motives. African diplomatic personnel began avoiding Israeli technology in their communications. International conferences featuring Israeli participants saw African delegates conspicuously absent from technical sessions. But the most profound shift occurred in the consciousness of African populations themselves. For generations, technological dependence had been accepted as natural. The belief that advanced capabilities must come from more developed nations, and that African countries should be grateful for whatever assistance they received. Our revelations challenged this assumption by exposing technology transfers as Trojan horses designed to maintain, rather than reduce, dependence. The generational impact of this awakening was especially significant. Young Africans raised in a digital world began questioning the origins and security of the platforms they use daily. University students studying computer science and engineering demanded curricula that included technological sovereignty and security analysis. Entrepreneurs explored indigenous alternatives to foreign technology solutions. This intellectual ferment created fertile ground for genuine African technological capabilities. Innovation hubs in Lagos, Nairobi, and Cairo began focusing on secure communication systems, independent software development, and hardware manufacturing free from foreign oversight. The traditional brain drain, sending Africa's best technical minds to Western institutions, began to reverse as opportunities emerged for meaningful work in technological sovereignty at home. The response from traditional imperial powers revealed how deeply our actions disrupted established patterns of control. Western media struggled to frame our revelations without implicating their own surveillance relationships with Israel. European governments awkwardly defended intelligence partnerships while claiming ignorance of operations against their African counterparts. The United States faced especially complex challenges, as its extensive surveillance cooperation with Israel meant American intelligence had likely benefited from the operations we exposed. Congressional hearings were quietly initiated to assess the extent of American knowledge about Israeli activities in Africa. Diplomatic channels worked frantically to contain the fallout. France's reaction was particularly revealing. Its historical claims to special relationships with African nations were undermined by evidence showing it had facilitated Israeli surveillance operations through shared intelligence networks. The revelation that French technical assistance programs had served as cover for Israeli operations sparked angry confrontations in the French National Assembly and demands for investigations into intelligence service activities. But the most significant challenge to the established order came from the precedent we set for technological resistance. Other nations facing similar surveillance pressures began adopting our methodologies for detecting and countering foreign intelligence operations. The playbook we developed for technological sovereignty became a template adaptable to different contexts and threats. The Iranian government, long subject to intensive Israeli surveillance, requested detailed briefings on our counterintelligence techniques. Palestinian technical organizations sought assistance in detecting and neutralizing Israeli monitoring systems. Even European privacy advocates began studying our methods for identifying and exposing government surveillance capabilities. This diffusion of counter-surveillance knowledge represented a fundamental shift in the global balance of intelligence capabilities. For decades, Sophisticated surveillance had been the exclusive domain of major powers, giving them decisive advantages in international relations. Our demonstration that these capabilities could be detected, analyzed, and countered by determined smaller nations undermined the very foundation of intelligence-based imperial control. The training programs we created for other African governments became models of South-South technological cooperation, bypassing traditional North-South dependency. Engineers from multiple African countries began collaborating to develop indigenous surveillance detection systems. Intelligence professionals exchanged methodologies for scrutinizing foreign technical personnel and identifying potential surveillance operations. Most importantly, we advanced beyond defense into offense, developing capabilities that could turn surveillance systems back on their operators. Instead of merely resisting Israeli intelligence gathering, we started collecting intelligence about Israeli operations to protect other potential targets and expose the full scope of their activities. The success of these programs validated our core argument: technological sovereignty is not only a defensive necessity, but also an offensive asset capable of reshaping international power relationships. Working together, African nations proved they could build technical capabilities to rival those of traditional imperial powers, directed not toward domination, but toward liberation. This produced a profound and irreversible psychological transformation among African populations. The belief that Africa must always be a consumer rather than a producer of advanced technology gave way to evidence that African innovation could generate solutions tailored to African needs and values. Our journey from surveillance target to technological liberator revealed that the supposed choice between dignity and convenience was false. True security could only be achieved through indigenous capabilities, partnerships based on equality, and the rejection of technological relationships designed to perpetuate dependence. The dawn we had spoken of was no longer a metaphor, but a tangible reality. The emergence of an Africa able to protect itself, control its technological destiny, and offer alternatives to nations wary of surveillance disguised as cooperation. As that dawn spread across the continent, it illuminated a future where sovereignty was not merely a political aspiration, but a technological capability, something that could be built, defended, and shared among all peoples determined to be free.